Hi, good morning, and welcome to all of you. It's a pleasure to be here this morning to talk a bit about, I think of this as a scene setter, the context for why Asia is so exciting. I find introductions incredibly embarrassing, and Marx was very embarrassing. But he omitted one thing that I'm going to add, is that before I became an academic, which is before I became a journalist, I used to be a corporate lawyer. So if any of you can stay awake over the next 20 minutes, you'll be doing really well. But it's that kind of background that I hope to be able to bring some of the latest research, some of the thinking about how it is the world economy has changed and why that could have an impact on the way we think about the media business, obviously something which I've embraced as I've crossed over. And I must say, having crossed over from academia and law, one of the nicest things about media is that you have lovely makeup artists like Moira who make you actually look like you're awake on a Monday morning at 9:30 to talk about economics. But what I hope to do over the next few, like I said, in this session, is to talk to you a little bit about how to cover the changing world economy, because this is clearly something that I think is one of the most fascinating changes that I've come across, which is my motivation for changing career. So the very first thing I'll try and lead you through is the rise of Asia and how that's transforming the world economy into a multipolar world. We're leaving a time in which if the US were to do something, that is the only engine. That time is quickly receding. And then secondly, business is global. And I think many in this region would have always known that, but this is actually something which is a bit eye-opening for many others, that oftentimes we think of how businesses operate. They maximize their potential, their resources across different countries in the world, and they think about markets and capabilities in an interlinked way. And I'll try and bring out some of that and why it is that may still be the case, and that is very much the case, but it's still the case that a lot of markets, a lot of voices, a lot of our customers are still local. It's getting that blend right, which would be important. And one of the things that I and the BBC try to do is to try and be a source of this news with trying to pick up the global impact, but also give value added and context and analysis, because these days we're inundated with news. But how to make sense of the news is something that we're very keen to do. And that's why I gave you a little bit about my background, and that's where that comes from. So, the rise of the multipolar world economy, if you look at the share of GDP in the world economy, it used to be the G7 countries were the predominant part of the world economy. If you look at just a decade ago, they accounted for 43% of global output. Now, by consensus forecasts, in the next year, it's going to be the BRIC economies, but mostly China and India, plus Russia and Brazil, which will account for the same share as the G7. So that essentially means the weight of output, of income, of markets are going to be pretty equally shared between the big emerging economies and the rich countries as they're currently defined. And that's a huge shift in the way that we think about the world. And by breaking out China and India, you can see that China and India are the biggest drivers of this, in particular China. So this is a chart from the London School of Economics' Danny Quah, where he estimated where the center of world economic gravity is moving. So in 1980, when the US was the main engine, the center of economic gravity in the world was somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. And right now, it's roughly speaking just east of Europe. But by 2020, him and others say that the center of economic gravity, where most economic activity will take place, will be China and in the Asia-Pacific region. And this is, again, a seismic shift in the way that, at least we in living memory, think about the world economy and markets. And what's actually changed? And I think I've always thought of this chart as one of the most telling. This is plotting foreign direct investment. So this is the amount that foreign companies invest in different countries. And as you can see, in the early 1990s, the entire investment pattern of the world changed. A lot more money started to go into emerging economies. And the reasons for it are a few. So one, in 1992, China's open door policy took off. In 1991, India turned outward and adopted export-oriented policies. And Eastern Europe rejoined Western Europe and integrated into the world economy. So by doing that, by bringing on stream all of these workers and all of these consumers in the world economy, attracted foreign companies. And Richard Freeman of Harvard calls it the great doubling. In other words, the global labor force doubled to 3 billion people in the early 1990s. And that's where the money started to track the change in people, markets, the middle class that were emerging. And as you can see before that, there really wasn't much move into emerging economies. So the world economy really was transformed. When I used to show this chart when I was teaching at Oxford, I became quite depressed showing it because I could see some knowing glances here. You're thinking of the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall. I had students who were born in 1992 who would look at me blankly and say, early 1990s, the world changed. I think I recall my parents saying that when I was 2. So I'm actually very happy to be with you now. And the real shift. And I think I use this as an indicator, again, of how global economic weight and power is shifting. This is the G20 countries divided into advanced and emerging economies. The blue line is the advanced economies, the red line is the emerging. This is the first time outside of world wars where the share of debt as a share of GDP is higher in advanced economies than emerging economies. And not just higher, the level of debt is double that of emerging economies and advanced economies. It's 80%, which is the median debt level for rich countries. It's 40% for emerging economies. What had been holding emerging economies back, which was high debt levels and overhang, has begun to recede. Debt is now a problem that the rich countries worry about. Fiscal deficits, debt overhang. And this is a huge change. And again, this is one of the reasons for the spurt in growth potential. A longer-term view of Asia, I really love this chart, which is from Angus Maddison, the economic historian. He plotted world GDP going back to the year 1 AD. I don't know what the world economy was like in 1 AD, so I've taken it back to 1820. And what you see is that Asia's share in global GDP was roughly the same as its share in terms of global population. So Asia was about 60% of the world's population, and that's the share of world GDP it accounted for in the early 19th century. But it lost share of world GDP throughout the 19th century, the early part of the 20th century. And what you're seeing now is a recovery of sorts, where GDP from Asia is beginning to better match its population share. Because Asia is about 50% of the world's population, 60% if you extend it slightly more towards Central Asia. And now GDP is beginning to match once again. By the way, for those of you who are now thinking back to your history studies, you know, obviously, during this period, the Industrial Revolution happened. That's a whole other question as to why it is China didn't have an Industrial Revolution the same time as Germany, Britain, or the United States, which propelled their growth spurt. But the news from emerging markets now in Asia is that they are undergoing industrialization, which is the other big driver. And with industrialization is the exponential rise in incomes. So the growth that we see in China and Asia today, if you have been around during Dickens' era in London, it would be like witnessing the industrialization process. Some of it messy, pollution, what have you, but the rise in incomes is phenomenal, and that's what this is associated with. And if you really want to look into this, this is called the Needham puzzle. A Cambridge scholar spent 40 years trying to work out why there was this dip. He still hasn't found an answer, so I'm just going to move on from this slide. Think scale. The other thing about, in particular, China coming on stream as a major market is, I use this chart to show you what that actually means. The US has about 300 million Android, iOS, mobile users. China's just overtaken the US, but China has 1 billion more people yet to come on stream. The internet users in China is 618 million. I mean, the scale of China coming on stream is just difficult to overstate. The bulk of the middle class is forecast to be in Asia within the next dozen years or so. That breaks it down in terms of where we were, the global middle class, just 2 years ago, and how that's projected to shift. And this is a middle class that is, again, being driven by the rise of Asia, the reemergence of Asia. Half of the biggest firms in the world are Chinese. These rankings vary a little bit depending if you're looking at market capitalization or assets or revenues. But generally speaking, if you look at the biggest companies in the world, about half of them are actually Chinese, and right outside of the top 10 as well. I mean, global companies are one of the best indicators of the ability of a country to leapfrog, to jump up. It's one of the things that countries which have joined the ranks of rich countries share in common. I'm going to pause and give you an anecdote here because sometimes you may not, working in the region, you may well be familiar with kind of the rise of Chinese companies, but I know plenty of people who are less familiar with it and will say, but China only produces really cheap stuff. Maybe these big companies are just, state money, which a lot of them are, and I'll show you in a moment that they are. But it's very fast for some of these changes to occur in terms of the ability of a country to catch up and to grow. And I'll give you an example. Have any of you seen the movie Back to the Future with Michael J. Fox? Oh, thank goodness. Again, another movie from the 80s where my undergraduates look at me saying, oh yeah, I saw that on the Classic Channel. Anyways, in this movie, Michael J. Fox, he's in the 1980s, he goes back to the future. He goes back to the 1950s to keep his parents together. Because remember, his parents are going to be broken up by Biff the bully. And he goes back, he meets this scientist guy with the crazy hair, and the scientist says, I don't believe you're from the future. Give me some proof. Tell me something about the future. And Michael J. Fox says, the president of the United States is Ronald Reagan. And the scientist says, you're kidding. A B-movie actor is president of the United States? You're pulling my leg. You're not from the future. And then he tries something else. Tell me something else. So Michael J. Fox says, you see that, you see your TV and stuff? In the future, Japan makes crazy cool stuff, like big screen TVs, great VCR players and all this. And the scientist looks at him and says, now I know you're just full of it. Because made in Japan is synonymous with low-end manufacturing. You're not from the future. And in 30 years, how quickly that's changed. For those of you who are thinking, what's a VCR? Don't come and see me during the coffee break. Biggest IPOs are state-owned firms. Like I said, obviously, one of the interesting changes in the rise of markets is the rise of state-owned enterprises, state-owned firms, state-backed firms, state-finance firms. And this is not just in China, it's also in other parts of the world. So the landscape in terms of the corporate sector is more complicated. State financing does have implications for the playing field and what have you. So it is something worth noting. Here's my favorite indicator of ascendancy and the rise of the multipolar world. The best airports in the world. First is Singapore. Half are in Asia. None are in the US. As somebody who travels a lot, I know how important airports are to business travelers. And to me, this is a sign of where the business weight and activity are now located. But let me just give you my one big doubt about this survey, just before I move on. Heathrow is number 10. If anyone can explain that, they win a spot on my next show. Moving on. This is his view, the world as one market. But I want to show you something in terms of risk levels, because I think one of the reasons why context matters more than ever now is that there used to be a time where rich countries are viewed as safe and developing countries are viewed as risky. If you look at what's called CDS, credit default swaps, I'm so sorry I have to define this, is that this is essentially default insurance against a country defaulting on their debt. The higher the CDS, the higher the basis points which has to be paid to buy that insurance. So what you can see is that emerging economies are amongst the most risky, but they're interspersed these days with so-called rich countries, developed economies. The risk profile is much more complicated than it had been in the past. So in other words, yes, it's one market, but understanding what drives these markets matters a lot more. Generalizations just don't really work very well anymore. And let me give you another hypothetical way to picture what I mean about the world economy. This is the old world. This is the US growth rate plotted against the world growth rate and the European growth rate. Not a terrible amount of excitement. The US recovered to nearly 7% growth after the early 80s recession. Big dip in the global financial crisis a few years ago. But for the most part, we're talking about pretty close movement between world GDP and US and EU GDP. Now, let's look at what the new world with emerging economies driving growth looks like. That scale is different. Emerging economies could be 10% growth one year, and it could drop to under 7% in the following year. They are much more volatile for lots of reasons. They're developing countries. Institutions aren't as developed. They're in the catch-up phase of growth. If you think about the West during the Industrial Revolution, it's not an even process. There's lots of reasons why you have to brace yourself for a more volatile world environment. But of course, over the longer term, you still have to bear in mind where the growth potential is. But in the nearer term, as you're working out your forecast, your markets, just be aware these markets are much more volatile for a number of reasons. Shift of wealth, bringing this to media, markets, advertising, there is an incredible increase in the amount of wealth in Asia Pacific. In the latest forecast of wealth, it's up some 12%, taking the total in the region to about $12 trillion. And that is bigger than any GDP in the world aside from the US and the EU taken together. So it's a huge shift in terms of growth translating into the new middle class, translating into wealth and disposable income, which is the indicator that we care about the most. The rise of the affluent. This interesting survey shows that in China in particular, nearly 80% of the affluent consumers care about brands. And it's very high in other parts of the region as well. Malaysia, India, Indonesia, over half of the consumers are very brand conscious. And some other indicators, which are like Bentley, Rolls-Royce, have really increased their sales in countries where the average income is still quite low. That gives them their growth potential. But the consumers in the professional class already have the disposable income to buy brands that they think are valuable. And this is, again, something which is quite new in a lot of these countries. And another thing to bear in mind, especially if you operate in these markets, and I've hinted at the size and the scale of Chinese multinational companies. If you enter their market, they're big players within their domestic market. Lenovo, which was one of the very first commercial deals ever done by a Chinese company. Samsung, the Korean company, market leader globally in terms of Android devices. Tencent, massive Chinese e-commerce company. For those of you who've been following the news, Weibo, the Chinese version of Twitter, is going to have its IPO. Alibaba just announced plans to have its US IPO, and it would be the biggest IPO since Facebook, raised $16 billion last May. These are the deals which are coming on stream. The dominance of these companies in their own markets also mean they are opportunities, they are great platforms, but they're also competitors, depending on where you stand. Alibaba, for instance, accounts for probably something like 80% in certain segments of the e-commerce market in China's massive internet market. And so these are the kinds of corporate landscapes, I think, to be aware of in Asia. Chinese consumers, of course, massive consuming class. This is just a breakdown in terms of how much disposable spending they're doing. The gray is necessities. The top bit is disposable spending. And that has increased a great deal. And again, just a word in terms of what this means. Average incomes in China are still low. $8,000 on average is earned every year, adjusted for purchasing power parity. But there will be at least 100 million, depending on how you measure the middle class, who have disposable income of a sufficient level to make them part of the global middle class. But if I told you a conservative estimate of, say, 120 million, I mean, that's double the population of Britain, which is one of the biggest economies in the world. I mean, just the scale of China's urban middle class is pretty astounding. And as they now continue to grow probably 7.5%, that means that their incomes will double in a decade. So again, the kind of the rise of their incomes and the opportunities that poses, it's a unique combination. In other words, the world's second biggest economy is also a poor developing country with growth potential in the 6-7% range. That's pretty much unheard of. The biggest economies in the world are rich countries for the most part, until China came along. So China worries about slowing down to 7%. You take the rule of 70, you divide it by the growth rate, and that gives you the number of years it takes for an economy to double in size. China was growing at 10%. Its incomes doubled every 7 years. Now slowing down to 7%. Growth rate means that its incomes double in 10 years. In Britain, the growth rate, well, Europe, maybe 1%. Once you do that calculation, you start to feel a little bit sorry for your friends and neighbors back in Europe, or you could just ring them up and tell them that you've learned the rule of 70 and and you've worked out where the growth rate is going to come from. But anyways, that's why Asia is so exciting. It's not just China, it's also other big countries in the region, India, Indonesia. With these kinds of growth rates generated by industrialization, it means that some of the biggest economies in the world have the growth rates of developing countries. And that is a new phenomenon. That's why there's a multipolar world, and there's more than one engine of growth. So what does this mean for media and marketing? It's projected that this year, Asia Pacific will exceed the North America, the United States, Canada, Mexico in terms of spend. Increase in e-commerce, over $1 trillion of that was done in 2012. Mobile users, another huge, huge avenue. And social media continues to drive purchases. You heard Mark there talking about Twitter. The rise of social media has been pretty phenomenal. I have personally found it hard to keep up with some of the changes. One of my producers asked me the other day, why aren't we friends on WeChat? Just as I was getting on top of WeChat, I was then sent another message saying, will you send me something on WhatsApp? So it is fast changing, but it also shows that the younger, I am dating myself too much in this talk, that especially if you look at some of the affluent users, they are obviously picking more and more of their news and their connectivity on mobile devices. So anyways, just to wrap up, the outlook for the next 12 months. The world economy is finally recovering, I'm happy to say. I always say that with a bit of trepidation because anybody who says recovery is on the way, you just never know. You never know what can happen. But for what it's worth, the trends look like the world economy is recovering. The US has regained pre-crisis levels of GDP. And Asia is leading the way, and the EU is beginning to gain ground, except for, of course, Ukraine, Turkey, Fed tapering, all sorts of risks that could happen that could drag the region back into a crisis. And media and marketing tend to move in line with business cycles. It's very much a discretionary spend trend. And so as the economies recover, there tends to be more, consumers have more income, businesses tend to be more willing to look at catering to those consumers. It's a different part of the cycle. And I think one of the most important points that I hope to have made this morning is how do you realign to a world where there's multiple engines of growth, but a different set of engines of growth? The world economy is more volatile. Emerging markets are inherently different in the way that they have state-dominated firms. It's a different playing field in those markets and against companies from those markets. But what is clear is that for the first time, really, in the post-war period, emerging economies are re-emerging. They're contributing to the global middle class. China is a bigger engine of growth right now and has been since the 2008 crisis than even the United States. The biggest economies in the world will soon be predominantly emerging economies at current growth rates. And that is a very, very different world than what we're used to. But let me finish with this. I made this point a couple of times because I think it's in many ways, the most pertinent point. To have the biggest markets in the world have growth potential of 5, 6, 7, 8% is extraordinary. It's simply extraordinary. You look at the rich countries before, growing at 2 to 3%. Remember the rule of 70. Incomes are growing, but it's nothing like the transformative growth rates in this region. And I think that's ultimately what makes it exciting. And it's not just the middle class, it's also the looming end of poverty. 1 billion people, as a result, have been lifted out of poverty since 1990. 1 billion people. Within the next few decades, it could be the end of poverty if growth rates continue in the emerging world as it currently is. And that is good for business, but frankly, it's just good. And that's why ultimately I think it's great you're here. Asia is terribly exciting. And if any of you can tell me the reason why Heathrow is in the top 10, I would be really grateful. But anyways, thank you very much for your time.